The manhwa starts with our main character, Tessa, being close with a guy named Hart. She thinks to herself about how much she has wanted to be with him. Then, it flashes back to when they are sitting outside under a tree. Hart asks Tessa why she snuck into his room, and she tells him she left something in there. She apologizes and asks if she woke him up. He says he hopes she's sure she really left something there, and isn't hiding anything from him. She says no, he knows she wouldn't do that. The scene shifts again to another moment. Hart asks Tessa why she did it, why she sold him off just to become some rich man's wife. At Marquess de Juted's castle, there are voices shouting as the castle is in flames. One voice orders to kill all the men, while another voice guides Lady Tessa on which way to go. The first voice says not to let anyone escape. Tessa is on the floor, scared for her life. Hart stands in front of her, smirking as he says it's been a while. He asks her if she enjoyed herself, living the high life, as that old blue blood's wife. She thinks to herself that, of course, she didn't, it was hell. He calls her a traitor, and she admits to herself with tears falling that she is indeed a traitor. She's a traitor who sold off the person she loves as a gladiator slave. Hart pulls up a chair to sit and tells her to start talking. He asks if she knows what kept him going for those 7 years he spent in that place. He says he refused to die without knowing why she betrayed him. When he saw her face earlier, he wanted to kill them both right on the spot. She tells him to kill her, saying that a traitor like her doesn't deserve to be loved. He replies that she shouldn't think she'll get off easily, she's going to pay him back. He pushes her onto the table and starts to unbuckle his trousers, saying he wants to tell her something. He says she was his from the beginning and it should have been him by her side all this time. Tessa pleads with him to stop and not do it, but he doesn't listen and grabs her instead. She manages to run from him and goes to a corner, crying. She tells him not to come any closer. He asks her if he scares her and if he's that repulsive to her. She trembles, apologizing to him. He kicks the table and says she's cruel. 7 years ago, at the orphanage where Tessa lives, the madam calls her over. The madam asks Tessa to sit with her and her husband. Her husband tells Tessa that he has good news. He says the benefactor of the orphanage, the Baron, is looking for a maid for his daughter. Her ladyship is in delicate health and needs a maid to assist her on her journey to the capital. The Baron's daughter has her heart set on a maid with red hair, just like Tessa's. He says if she accepts, the Baron's household is willing to take Hert on as a squire. Tessa thinks to herself that if it means she and Hert can always be together, she's willing. She tells him she agrees, and he smiles sinisterly, saying it's a wonderful opportunity. He presents a document, and says they just need her thumbprint now. She asks what the document says, and he reassures her, saying it's just a formality. He insists all they need is her thumbprint, and to ensure she gets Hert's thumbprint too. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to go together. He emphasizes she mustn't tell anyone about this. It's the reason Tessa sneaked into Hert's room to secretly take his thumbprint. She thinks to herself that she knows this will make him happy, because it's his dream to become a knight. He'll understand when she explains everything later. A few days later, the man tells her she has to leave today. He asks what's the point of her waiting around. He tells her she'll meet Hert soon enough there. She says there's something she needs to say to Hert. He suggests she leave him a letter since she never learned to write. He advises her to just tell him what she wants to say. Inside the carriage, the Lady Tessa was supposed to work for says how stupid she can be. She wonders why anyone would want an orphan like her as a maid. She declares that Tessa will become the Marquess's concubine instead. She mentions hearing that another like Tessa is coming as a gladiator slave. She warns Tessa not to pretend she doesn't know about that either. Tessa realizes the lady is talking about Hert, who is now a slave and not a knight's squire. She returns to confront the man, who calls her foolish. She asks him how could he do this, and he replies that she wanted it. He questions if she still doesn't understand. He supposes not, otherwise she wouldn't have put her thumbprint on a contract she couldn't read. It's because of her that Hert was sold as a slave. 3 years later, a letter had arrived for Tessa. She had asked the servant if the letter said the person was well. He had told her he thought he mentioned it was not good news. Hert of Fitzrold had been killed in combat, as it said right there. She had trembled as he had explained it was a common fate for gladiator slaves. He was afraid. She had asked herself inwardly if Hert was dead. It couldn't be possible. She wanted to be happy with him. Presently, she collapsed on the ground, crying heavily. Eventually, she begged Hert to kill her. Later, as they walk, Deputy Rang Jeffrey tells Hert that their report is ready. He mentions they've cleared the castle of spies and supporters of the Marquess, except for those in the annex. There's nothing else major to report. Hert then asks about Lord Ferdale, and Jeffrey responds they are still chasing him. They think they'll catch him today since he couldn't have gotten far. As Hert opens a drawer, Jeffrey asks if he's searching for something. Hert replies it's personal, and tells him to mind his own business. He holds up a ring, and Jeffrey comments that it's a wedding ring. Seeing all the ladies in the annex, Jeffrey isn't surprised there are so many. What does surprise him, though, is the ring itself. It's too plain. He wonders aloud how someone could marry the Marquess de Juttet with such a simple ring. As Hert thinks about Tessa, he tosses a box of jewelry on the floor. Jeffrey asks what he's up to, suggesting they could sell the jewelry for money. Hert waves off the idea, saying it's just pocket change. Jeffrey insists it's not about the money, and instructs a servant to retrieve the box that had just fallen. Hert spots the notebook he was sent to find. He thinks to himself that the woman who sent him must have known Tessa was here all along and sent him on purpose. Jeffrey interrupts, asking Hert what their plans are for the ladies in the annex. Hert replies that they'll make their report and wait for further instructions. If nothing specific comes up, they'll decide what to do next themselves. Hert remembers how earlier Tessa was pleading with him. He decides that Jeffrey should bring Tessa to him as soon as she wakes up. In Tessa's bedroom, as she opens her eyes, she sees Manny, her maid, who asks how she's feeling. Tessa simply requests water. Manny quickly brings water to Tessa and helps her drink, mentioning she has a fever and should rest. Tessa asks where she is, and Manny explains they are in the annex now. They've moved everyone from the household here. Manny remarks on the chaotic past few days, with everyone feeling scared. It turns out the new lord isn't as bad as they feared. Tessa realizes Hert is now the new lord of the Juttet estate. She starts shaking, and Manny hurries off to fetch a doctor. In her thoughts, Tessa wonders why Hert spared her life if she's no use to him. What could he possibly want from her? She recalls their last meeting and acknowledges that he's just a man after all. She shouldn't be surprised. It's not like she has anything to lose. At least this way, she thinks, there's something she can do to help Hert. A guard enters, insisting that Tessa needs to go with him immediately. Manny explains that Tessa is still unwell, but the guard says he's just following Sir Hert's orders, and will use force if necessary. Tessa reassures Manny that it's okay, and believes Hert must have his reasons. She attempts to stand up, but she wobbles, needing Maggie's support as she walks. Another woman bursts into the room and asks Tessa where she's going. She's noticeably pregnant. She's Janet, the seventh wife of the Marquess de Juttet. Tessa questions why Janet is here, but she takes Janet's hands. Janet comments that Tessa's hands are cold, but Tessa insists she's fine and needs to go. No, she must go. The guard accompanies Tessa and tells her to wait in one of the office rooms. She starts coughing and thinks to herself that it hurts. Those lashes on her back are really painful. She struggles to breathe. Maybe it's her fever acting up. But no, she tells herself she has to snap out of it because Hert might think she's pretending. Glancing at the portrait of the Marquess, she mutters that he was a terrible man. Hert enters the room and mentions that he's the one who killed the Marquess. Tessa calls out his name, and he admits he wants to kill her too, yet something stops him. He finds it strange and asks her what he should do with her now. Tessa drops to her knees, saying he can do whatever he wants. She feels she can never make up for all her wrongs, but she's willing to do anything to try. Tessa pleads with Hert, asking him to let her make it up to him. Confused and frustrated, he pushes her back, demanding to know what she's doing. She insists she's trying to repay him, but Hert is incredulous. He can't believe she's serious, especially since she's always been repelled by his touch. He asks if this is some kind of joke to her. Tessa, clearly nervous, begs him to give her a chance. Hert wonders to himself what kind of person she thinks he is. Hert unzips his trousers and exposes himself, telling Tessa to do something for him. He's taken aback by how good she is at it and asks her where she learned to do it. He suspects she must have done this with someone else. After he finishes, she apologizes for not doing it the way he wanted and promises to do better if given another chance. He drags her to the table roughly, ignoring her pleas about being hurt. Hert orders her to be quiet and forces himself on her. Tessa cries and begs him to stop, but he only moves faster. Eventually, he notices she has gone silent, and when he shakes her, he realizes she has passed out. In a flashback, Tessa is chatting with a lady at the orphanage. The lady says Hert scares her because he never smiles or talks to the others. Tessa disagrees, saying Hert always smiles and talks a lot. The lady points out that Hert acts this way because he and Tessa are close, but he is scary to the others. She then suggests that maybe Hert likes Tessa. Hert walks up to them, and the lady quickly runs off, telling Tessa she has to leave. Hert grabs the bucket of water from Tessa's hand. She tells him she can handle it, and he shouldn't worry. He reminds her about the last time she spilled the water, but she insists she needs to do it herself when he's not around. He assures her she doesn't need to worry because he'll always be by her side. Surprised to hear this, Tessa says the others keep saying that Hert likes her. He asks her what she thinks and if she believes he likes her. Tessa says she doesn't know because he's always nice to her and they are always together, but it feels strange to think he would ever like her. Before she can finish her sentence, Hert says he does like her. Presently, Tessa is on her bed, and Manny gives her some medicine, telling her to make sure she drinks all of it, even if it's bitter. Manny says that, according to Dr. Kenneth, it's really important she doesn't skip meals and gets plenty of rest if she wants to get better. Manny also gives her a salve to apply once or twice a day. Tessa looks at the salve and thinks to herself that it's still better than when she was with the Marquess. It hurts like it always has, but that makes sense since it's meant to be a punishment. Manny brings her some soup, and it looks good. Tessa thinks about how Hert used to take care of her like this all the time, when they were younger. She then asks Manny why she's so good to her since it's not like she's anyone special. Manny sits close to her, and says that of course she's there to take care of her, she's her maid. She explains that not just her, but everyone here is at her service by the order of his lordship, Sir Hert. Tessa asks if that's what Hert said, and Manny says yes, so she shouldn't worry and should just focus on getting her strength back. Tessa thinks to herself, wondering if this is a test, if Hert wants to see what she'll do if she's at his mercy. She doesn't want to be someone who would use Hert anymore. She needs to remember that he hates her. He could only ever hate a traitor like her. She starts crying, thinking that she ruined everything. A fortnight later, Janet happily calls Tessa and hugs her, excited about her recovery. She says life in the annex is so comfortable now, with even more freedom than before. Then, she asks Tessa if she's always known Sir Shine, the new lord. Tessa stutters, saying she's never heard of him. She thinks to herself that she knew it all along. Hert didn't need someone like her to become a knight. Janet asks what's going on between them, but Tessa says they're not anything at all. Janet apologizes, saying she shouldn't have asked. Janet comes into Tessa's room with news. The news was supposed to give hope to the current situation, but instead, it makes Tessa shudder. Her former master's wife wants to meet with her. Tessa feels uneasy, unsure if she can trust the woman's intentions. Lady Elena Juttet, the Marquise de Juttet, was the first wife of the Marquess de Juttet and the mother of Lord Ferdale Juttet. After a carriage accident, she became paralyzed from her waist down and was confined to the West Tower. Tessa starts expressing her concerns, wondering why she's eager to meet Janet. Before she can finish, Janet interrupts, urging her to agree to the meeting. She reassures Tessa that the decision is hers, and she can take it at her own speed. Suddenly, a maid bursts in and urgently informs Tessa that the Lord has returned. Elsewhere in the castle, Hert and a woman are having a conversation. The woman confesses that she's the one who guided him to Tessa, hoping he would be pleased by her surprise. Hert is at a loss for words and decides to leave, walking away from the conversation. The sound of horses trotting along a path pulls attention as they pull a carriage. The deputy, chosen by the Marquess, goes with Hert as they return to the castle. He tries to show concern for Hert, who is clearly exhausted, but instead of helping, it only makes Hert more annoyed. Sir Mosen Bosch greets Hert as he steps out of the carriage. Sweat beads on Mosen's face as he tells Hert about Lord Ferdale's second escape. Hert's headache worsens at the mention of Lord Ferdale. He instructs them to secure Lord Ferdale again, emphasizing that he must be kept alive because he's needed. Mosen also updates Hert about Tessa, confirming that he followed Hert's instructions. In Tessa's chambers, Janet helps her get ready for her meeting with Hert. Despite Janet's reassuring words, Tessa remains nervous as she's being prepared. Suddenly, Tessa's mind flashes back to the hurtful insults from the Marquess when she tried to dress up. The memory fades as quickly as it came. The memory forces Tessa to doubt her worth, and if she should even go and meet with Hert. She speaks ill of herself, hoping that Janet will let her be, and she won't go. Janet is as stubborn as a mule and refuses Tessa. Deep down, she knows why Tessa must meet with Hert. Janet finishes applying Tessa's makeup and goes off to find matching shoes. Manny, the maid, helps Tessa into her new dress. As Manny assists, she gasps when she sees Tessa's back. Scars cover her skin like a patchwork. These scars are reminders of the times Lord Ferdy hurt her. He would lure her in with promises of treating her better than his father did, but when she refused him, he would punish her with his belt, leaving these marks on her back. Tessa freezes as she feels Manny's hesitation. Anxiety builds up inside her, and she insists once more that she doesn't want to go. Manny quickly regains her composure and reassures Tessa that the scars aren't as bad as she thinks they are. Manny assists Tessa in putting on a stunning green gown. The color resembles the lush green of nature itself. The neckline dips low, showing off a flattering glimpse of her cleavage, and the gown flows elegantly down to the floor. Manny selects green heels with gold details to complement the outfit. Half of Tessa's red hair is pinned back, while the rest cascades down her neck. She looks stunning. Manny and Janet gush over their handiwork, admiring Tessa. Tessa is about to mention that she doesn't feel like going, when a knock on the door interrupts her. Soon, Janet and Tessa stroll through the halls, heading towards their meeting with Hert. Tessa keeps trying to find a way to back out, but Janet is determined and doesn't allow her to change her mind. Mosen guides Tessa towards Hert. She struggles with feelings of low self-esteem, worried that Hert will be upset about her choice of attire. In the same hallway, Lord Ferdale crosses their path. He bumps into them, a wicked smile spreading across his face. Tessa shakes with fear as she confronts Ferdale face to face. Memories of his past abuse flood her mind, making it hard for her to stay composed. Mosen quickly steps in front of Tessa, drawing his sword to protect them. Ferdale is unpredictable and known for his quick temper. He taunts Tessa, mocking her for her attire and asking where she thinks she's going dressed like that. A cruel grin spreads across his face as he connects the dots in his mind. He hurls hurtful words at Tessa, referencing intimate moments she shared with Hert. He goes on to talk about how his father's death supposedly influenced Tessa's behavior for the worse. Tessa attempts to defend herself, but her voice gets lost amidst Ferdale's cruel taunts. Mosen steps in to shield her, but he can't physically harm Ferdale, so he brandishes his sword as a warning. Ferdale isn't scared. He challenges Mosen and pushes him away to have a full access to Tessa. With Mosen out of his way, Ferdale advances towards Tessa. He continues to insult and with a clenched fist, he's ready to take his revenge. Suddenly more armed men arrive at the scene and are led by Rang Jeffy, who is the deputy to Hert. Rang and his men apprehend Ferdale and lead him away. He calmly approaches Tessa and applauses for the commotion. He calms her nerves and leads her to Hert. They stand in front of the large, black doors of Hert's office. Jeffrey opens the door to see Mosen giving Hert the report for the week. Hert's attention is stolen as Tessa enters the room. The air is knocked out of his lungs as he takes her in. Mosen continues to speak, unaware of the audience behind him. Hert stops him and tells him to come back later to continue the report. Mosen promises to compile the rest of the report before he returns. Both Mosen and Jeffrey leave the room, leaving only Tessa and Hert. Tessa feels out of place as she observes the spacious office. Two bright red chairs are adjacent to one another, with a brown table in the middle. A bookshelf leans by the wall with a window beside it. A golden chandeliers hang from the ceiling. Tessa's eyes finally land on Hert. The man is an epitome of beauty as the sunlight hits him perfectly. She observes him and discovers that he is writing. Hert looks at her for a brief second and sighs. He looks back down and instructs her to take a sit because she is distracting him. Feeling embarrassed, Tessa apologizes and takes a seat. She reflects on their past together. Back when they were in the orphanage, they never learned how to write because there wasn't enough time for activities like that. She's surprised that Hert knows how to write. She remembers when they would give him a list which contained things he had to get from the market. He'd looked puzzled, wondering why they continued to give him when they knew he could not read. Tessa always assured him that she heard them calling off the items on the list and that she knew them by heart. She'd want to ask for permission for both of them to get the items together. He would try to discourage her, but she always laughed him off. Now as she sits in his office, it dawns on her that Hert could read. Even though he was sold as a gladiator slave and sentenced to fight for his life, he still managed to learn on the battlefield. She compares her past to Hert's and tears brim at her eyes. She tried her best to learn, but her masters never gave her such a luxury. Subconsciously, she begins to scratch the back of her palm. She continues to scratch her hand as the memories plague her. The scratches grew deeper and blood starts to come out. Tessa tries in vain to fight off her memories and deems herself unworthy of death. She thinks that if she fought back, she and Hert would have had a happily ever after. Tessa scolds herself for those thoughts. Suddenly, Hert snatches her hand and frowns at her. He examines the self-inflicted wounds and his frown deepens. He yells out to her, thinking this is her way of backing out of their agreement. Tessa tries to explain herself, but it's a struggle and tears brim at her eyes. Hert sighs as her voice refuses to make an appearance. He tells her that this was her idea, to pay for her sins with her body. Gripping her chin, Hert makes her look at him and tells her that her body is his. After Hert tells her his command, he acknowledges her health and feels glad. He feels that the reason she is dressed that way was because of their agreement. He taunts her about their agreement, making sweat gather at her brows. She goes further to itch her palms, a habit of hers. He stops her and screams at her to never harm her body again. He flings her onto the sofa and gets intimate with her. During their intimacy, Hert reminisces about how rough he was with her the last time. How much it pained him to behave in such a manner that he had to flee the castle. But here he was doing it again, just that this time he didn't feel terrible. He was glad he got to claim her as his. When they finish, Hert backs the sofa and faces the bookshelf as he finishes dressing up. Tessa is sprawled up on the sofa, her breathing even. She wonders how long it has been and curses herself for being the cause of her predicament. Hert instructs her to come to his office whenever he sends for her, and that she knows the way back to her room. Tears fall freely from Tessa's eyes at how cold his tone was to her. Hert leaves the office and runs a hand down with a sigh as his memories haunt him. The two women walk through the granite-filled road. Dry leaves litter the ground and birds' nests are seen perching on the trees. Manny warns Tessa to watch her step and walk because of the steep terrain. Dressed in an ash dress, Tessa follows her maid with unease in her stomach. Her full red hair is pulled into a beaded hairnet, and her face is void of any makeup. Vines grow on the aged walls of the passage as they enter. Descending stairs, Manny warns Tessa to be careful of her steps. They stop in front of doors with golden handles. Manny announces that it's this way as she opens it. Both women walk into a stuffy room. First, they see a white rug with a brown chair by the side. In the middle of the room is a dull shaded rug on which two cream-colored armchairs are placed with a small brown table between them. Manny encourages Tessa to take a seat while she fetches the mistress. Tessa sits and a sheepish smile covers her face. She admires the house, admitting this is the kind of house she always wanted. She couldn't help but wonder about how life would have been here if she and Hert had left the orphanage all those years ago. If they had gotten the opportunity to stay here together. She slaps herself sillily, urging herself to wake up. The sound of creaky wheels pierces the air, announcing the lady that requested for her audience. She wears a black gown and has her hair cropped short with dark eyes. Her smile looks friendly as she welcomes Tessa into her home. Tessa shows appreciation for the invite by standing and acknowledging the lady's presence. Lady Elena smiles at her antics and calms Tessa's nerves, encouraging her to sit. She expresses her anticipation to meet with Tessa and asks her if she knew the reason for her request. Tessa shakes her head as sweat drips down her face. She trembles and starts to pick her nails. Elena reveals her reasons for a favor she needs to ask of Tessa. She reveals she knows of Tessa and Hert's acquaintanceship. Sipping her tea, she leans closer to Tessa and makes her request. Back in the castle, Tessa thinks about Lady Elena's request to come and visit her regularly. She wonders why the lady would want her company, because she knew she had nothing to offer the older woman. She's dragged out of her memories by Hert, who is being intimate with her. In another part of the castle, Manny serves Janet a glass of amber-colored liquid. Janet drinks it in one gulp. Janet returns the glass to the tray and says that she thinks that the atmosphere is too quiet. She feels something should have happened by now. Manny assures her that something is about to happen, and tells her to be more careful. Janet brushes her off as she takes the cloth from the bed and puts it under her clothes, making her look pregnant. She asks how long she needs to keep pretending. Manny reminds her that the charade was her idea, and wonders why she's complaining. Janet says that she thought the plan was the best action at the time, admitting that she didn't think ahead. Janet confesses that she did it to allow Tessa to have peace of mind from Ferdale. Manny asks her if they need to stay since they've accomplished their mission. Janet says that she's not done yet, and that she feels this will end soon. Along the walkway is Ferdale, who walks as a free man once more. He admits to himself that Jean was right and storms off. Mosen sweats profusely as he announces Ferdale's escape to Hert. He knew that he was going to have an earful as to why he has escaped again. Hert is clad in a robe and turns from the window at the message. He eyes the man in front of him and frowns. Mosen continues to speak despite the discomfort he feels from Hert's stare. He says that Ferdale managed to dig a hole under the wall. Hert swears and quickly dresses. He asks for his deputy. Mosen tells him that Jeffrey is searching the northern forest for Ferdale. Hert asks how long it has been and is told 2 hours. His anger rises as he demands why it's taking so long to catch a drug-addicted gambler. With no reason in mind, Mosen decides to apologize for the security's inadequacy. Hert instructs that more security is stationed in the castle, especially in Annex. He asks for men of his own to join the search. Mosen turns to leave and follow the orders, but Hert stops him by asking for the report. Mosen assures him that it will be ready by next week, but Hert demands that it should be ready by this week. Sweat covers his face as he bows to Hert. Hert's mind wanders to Tessa, admitting that it has been a week already. He wonders if she feels anything. He wonders why she feels that she doesn't deserve to live. He swears and sighs as his thoughts spiral, thinking about her. He later steels his mind and admits that she is a traitor and doesn't mean anything to him. Tessa crashes onto her bed in her chambers and sighs. She questions herself if it has been a week already. She admits to being tired of her antics with Hert, but doesn't have the heart to tell him. The window of her chambers rattle. Thinking it's a bird, she ignores it, but the rattle continues. She turns to see just in time for Ferdale to climb through. He curses at the guards as he jumps in. Seeing Tessa, an evil covers his face. He exclaims, surprised that this is where she has been hiding all this time. Tessa trembles on the bed, as a thin layer of sweat covers her body. Ferdale eats the distance between them and tries to grab her. Swiftly, Tessa turns and tries to run away. Ferdale catches her by her red hair, yanks her to him and covers her mouth with his hand. She refuses to resign to her fate and bites his finger. Ferdale cradles his sore finger and curses at her. She rushes away and heads for the doors. Tears and sweat mix on her face as she runs, urging her limbs to keep moving. She knew she had to leave the room quickly. Just before her hand could grasp the door's handles, she feels a stinging sensation on her face. She falls to the floor with her face sore. Standing above her is Ferdale, who swears at her for biting him. He grips her arm and drags her, saying how he wanted to go easy on her. He flings her to the bed and swears at her, blaming her for his current predicament. He leans into her face and taunts her. She trembles on the bed, hoping this nightmare would stop. He asks her how she seduced Lee Borwen's right hand, but she remains mute. His eyes gleam as an idea pops in his head. He tells Tessa that he will be intimate with her just to spite Hert. His words make Tessa's eyes widen and tears flow down her face. Her cheek feels sore from where he slapped her. She tries to voice her disapproval of his actions, but she struggles. She flinches as he tries to touch her. Before Ferdale could go further in his actions, he hears Hert's commands. They are looking for him, and it's only a matter of time before they find him. Ferdale bites his lip as nervousness washes over him. He decides on a new plan and brings out a dagger. The men storm into the room just in time for Ferdale to use Tessa as a shield and threatens her. He warns them to keep their distance. All Tessa could do was cry. Hert steps in front of the men. Hands in pockets and a snide smile, he tells Ferdale to kill her. Ferdale acknowledges Hert's appearance to the scene. He reinforces his threat, but Hert stands looking bored. Hert encourages him to go ahead with his threat. Ferdale smiles and taunts him that they shouldn't doubt him. Hert admits that he doesn't care about Tessa's life. His words sting Tessa to the core, and she wishes for the ground to open and swallow her in that moment. Ferdale screams outraged, refusing to believe his words. Throwing their antics out for everyone to hear, that if Hert doesn't care, then why is he intimate with her so often? Hert rolls his eyes and takes a step closer to the crazy man before him. Ferdale takes a step with Tessa in tow. He points the dagger and warns them not to come closer. In swift movements, Hert strides to them, disarms Ferdale and restrains him. The security rush forward to take Ferdale from Hert. Hert picks up the weapon and hands it over to one of the guards, saying that people like Ferdale will always be the first to be killed in a battle. He went further to say that his weapon couldn't kill anyone. Ferdale went on to taunt Hert even though he is being held by the security. He insults both Hert and Tessa. Hert threatens to cut off his tongue, but that only encourages him to continue speaking. Ferdale continues to insult Tessa. Fed up, Hert grips Ferdale and reminds him of his command. Ferdale doesn't look moved and Hert gives him a punch to punctuate his point. Mosen comforts Tessa, who trembles violently from her place on the floor. Hert notices her bruise and asks if she's bleeding. Mosen inspects the wound and confirms that it isn't deep. Suddenly, Tessa slumps. Mosen screams for her but she remains unmoving. Hert swiftly moves to her and carries her from the floor, bridal style. He demands a doctor be brought immediately. Tessa's mind flashes back to her conversation with Manny. Manny treats her wounds and tells her of how she lost her mother and sibling to the plague in her village. She says she had a friend that married a rich man in the next village so as to treat her own family. Manny admits that if she had the chance, she would have married a rich man to save her family. She tells Tessa to embrace the opportunity she is given. She says that if she could marry the old marquis in place of Tessa she would with no questions asked. Tessa argues that she doesn't want this. Manny laughs at her statement. She asks her if marrying against her will makes her a plaything. The chains in Tessa's mind begin to form as she remains quiet, not sure how to answer the question. Manny goes on to defend concubines, saying what makes one. She tells Tessa that this was the only way she will survive, and so should accept reality. The chains thicken in Tessa's mind as the conversation ends. Presently, while Tessa lays in a coma on her bed, the doctor and Hert speak. The doctor informs Hert that Tessa has reached her breaking point, that her vitals are too weak. She needs to be cared for properly unless she would get very sick. Hert stares at Tessa's unmoving form with no emotion in mind as the doctor speaks. He watches her sleep. As soon as the doctor stops speaking, Hert instructs him to leave them alone. As he watches her, he admits that she was losing herself in front of him. Him thinking that this is her way of getting back at him. He thinks that she should have been living a profitable life due to her actions to get here. Gripping her fingers, he whispers her name, saying that she can't die. Tessa blinks. Recognizing the ceiling above her, she realizes that she is in her room. The previous events come rushing at her, but she's unable to remember what happened after Ferdale held her captive. Movement in the corner catches her eyes. She turns her head, and is surprised to see Hert resting on the wall fast asleep. She uses her hand to cover her mouth as shock washes over her. She wonders what he's doing in her chambers. Tessa pulls the covers away, and allows the tip of her toes to touch the carpet. She readies herself to leave and search for Manny, but that never happened. Hert asks where she's going to as he grips her hand before she could leave. He demands she tell him what she needs and he will get it for her so she doesn't leave the bed. She insists on being fine, and attempts to leave. Hert stops and carries her back to her bed, ignoring her protests. He asks if she's thirsty, but she argues once again that she is fine. He asks her if she doesn't want him in the room, but she says that isn't the issue. He pours her a glass of water and gave it to her. She drinks and gives him the glass. He asks if she needs anything else and she tells him no. She wonders why he is being kind to her. It felt out of character to her. He asks if she wants food, but she claims to be fine once more. Her stomach betrays her and Hert looks at her dryly. He tells her that he will send for food. She assures him again that she is fine and he doesn't need to do so. Hert looks at her telling her that he doesn't care that she hates him. He says that she shouldn't show it and she should stop telling him that she is fine. Tessa ponders over his words, especially the part where he says that she hates him. Hert leaves her to her thoughts and speaks to Manny at the door. Tears brims at her eyes as she thinks over why Hert would think that she would hate him, especially after what she did to him. Hert comes back and places a hand on her forehead. He encourages her to speak if she starts to feel sick. He tells her to call the doctor or maid to cater for her so she doesn't black out again. He turns to a bowl of water and brings out a rag from it. He squeezes out the excess water and places it on her forehead. He grips her hand and uses his thumb to rub across the back of her palm, telling her to tell him immediately when she feels sick. He thinks to himself how he doesn't want her to faint again. Tessa turns away from him and scolds herself for thinking that he might really care about her. She doesn't mean anything to him. Tears fall from her eyes as she fights them off. She lies to Hert that there's something in her eyes causing her to tear up. Hert clenches his jaw as he sees her cry, the sight unappealing to him. He grips her to prevent her from rubbing her eyes. He reminds her of her former habits and holds back a smile. He cleans up her tears and calms her. He remembers their past, how he used to be happy to spend time with her. How she was always full of joy and so sweet that he couldn't help liking her. He corrects himself and admits that he loves the girl before him, or rather, he loved who she used to be, but not anymore. But the thing is, if he doesn't love her anymore, then why can't he stop worrying about her? In an office, Jeffrey studies Hert and Tessa's files, wondering what happened to them before now. He concludes that they were from the same orphanage. He figures out that she has woken up and decides to tell a very important lady. Jeffrey hurries through the halls to a secluded part of the darkness, where only candle lights illuminate the place. He opens a door and is greeted by the lady. The candle in her hand illuminates a pleasant smile. He acknowledges her with a smile of his own, as he says hello to Lady Janet. A woman named Lee faces the window and offers assurance to the questions she is asked. She admits to playing the villain. The person who questions her is none other than Queen Jean of the Kingdom of Meshu. Jean expresses her displeasure of Lee's actions, asking her to immediately stop. The two debate concerning the recent events of the town, and Lee explains to Jean that all the situations are connected. Jean grows furious as she realizes that Lee purposely didn't tell her about the situations until their present shortcomings. She questions her how long this has been happening. Lee smiles at the young queen's eagerness to understand the dire situation. She says it has been 1 year. She tells the queen to continue to spy on Hert so prevent him from destroying the kingdom. Hert stares at Tessa as she eats, silently, urging her to finish her soup. As soon as the last of it enters her mouth, she announces that she's done with her meal. He examines the empty plate and hands over her medicine, urging her to finish it. In one gulp, she drinks everything and returns the glass to him and offers her gratitude. Out of the blue, Hert pops a sweet in her mouth and instructs her not to savor it just as she used to when they were younger. He assures her that he has more. He examines her frame before heading over to the window to examine the night sky. The moon illuminates the lights coming from the houses, making the view look picturesque. Tessa watches him with uncertainty, wondering why he is being nice to her. After she had betrayed him, it surprised her. Then she remembers what Janet told her, that men will only be nice to you just to get in between your legs. Even though she didn't want to admit it, she knew that Janet was right. She concluded that the only thing Hert wanted was for someone to warm his bed, a body to use. Hert closes the window and turns around to face Tessa. He tells her to lie down. The request goes over her head, as Tessa concludes what her next course of actions must be to pay her debt. She gets on her knees and touches his intimate areas. She tries to encourage him to sleep with her. Hert slaps her hands away and demands what she is doing. Stammering, she tells him that she wanted to repay her debt. Tessa strongly believed that this was the only way to make up for her betrayal toward him. Hert's patience thins as he takes in her figure, kneeling on the bed and waiting to serve him. He yells at her to answer him, and why does she think that ripping her clothes off will please him? She flinches at his tone, sweat beading her brows. He asks her why she would put her hands on him. Swallowing her fear, Tessa voices out her thoughts from earlier. Hert stares at her, bewildered at her thought process. He asks her if she has been thinking this is her punishment. He yells at her asking if she knows what she did wrong, and she claims to do. Then he further questions her behavior. She starts apologizing, but he disregards it. He presses on further to tell her what he really wants to hear, that he didn't ask for her body. Tessa remains mute and trembles. Hert observes her for a while and frowns. He says that her behavior irritates him. He remembers how she used to be and admits to himself that he would have forgiven her by now. Looking at her now, his anger boils over. He knows how she used to be and wants her to behave like that. He thinks it over and convinces himself that her behavior is because of the Marquess. Tessa struggles to answer as tears gather in her eyes. Memories plague her of how badly she was treated, that made her into the trembling woman she is today. Hert sighs and regards with a cold look. He concludes her case and turns away. Tessa manages to croak out the letter, and that infuriates Hert more. He tells her the hurtful contents of the letter, and her brows crease. She defends herself by saying that wasn't what she wrote in the letter. Hert frowns and says that it doesn't matter what she wrote in the letter. All that matters is that she betrayed him, and there's no changing that. She tries to call his name, but his conscience distracts him. It reminds him of how she betrayed him by selling him into slavery. He walks to the door to leave, but spins around when he hears a light thud. Seeing Tessa on the floor, he clenches. He loves her a lot, and seeing her hurt wasn't a sight he enjoyed. He goes to her and helps her up. He accesses her to see if she's hurt. She apologizes to him and says that she isn't. He helps her back into bed. Before he has the chance to turn away, she begs him to punish her. She senses his hesitation and urges him to punish her. He loses his cool when Tessa says he should kill her if he's bored of her. He goes on tell her to do it herself and not soil herself. He notices her movements and grips her hand. He pries a dagger from her. Throwing it away, he stares at her in disbelief. He asks if she just tried to do it herself. Hert glares at her and grips her. In warning, he tells her not to do it in his presence. The thought of Tessa not being with him anymore wasn't something he wanted. He makes Tessa promise, and she does. He kneels before her as he speaks, sincerity in his tone. He tugs her closer and wraps his hands around her. He tells her to stop crying. Despite her tears, she pleads with Hert to be intimate with her. Manny carries a tray from the kitchen and heads to the main room. Many things cross her mind, but she pushes them away to focus on the task at hand. Entering the main room, she smiles warmly at Lady Elena and the guest. Manny doesn't see the guest's face and can only admit that it was a woman. She drops the tray and awaits for more orders, but Elena sends her away. The guest stares at the maid as she leaves. She stays fixated on the door as the footsteps fade away. Turning to Elena, she voices out her concern for secrecy. She warns Elena of how important it is to cover her tracks. Elena stares at her guest and questions if it truly was her company her guest wanted. Janet replies that the preparations are completed and that she came to confirm if everything was in place so they could continue with the plan. Janet also announces that another reason for her coming was because there's someone who wasn't happy to see her. It's Elena's turn to warn Janet of secrecy, and Janet says that she hasn't broken cover in 2 years. Elena asks for Tessa's health and Janet tells her that she hasn't left Hert's side. Janet goes on to speak, but Elena cuts her short saying she doesn't want to hear it, because she has heard it before. Janet giggles and says that there's no harm in hearing it again. She assures Elena that it's not her fault, and she should have faith in her nephew. In another part of the castle, where mice place. Lit candles hang on bulk metal to illuminate the place. A man's voice is heard down the corridor. He screams for help. No one pays it any heed, as the security walks around. The candles reflect a frustrated Ferdale. Ferdale kicks his cell gates, angry at his current predicament. He searches his mind for a solution, but comes up short. He curses out loud, frustration coursing through his veins. He asks himself what he's doing here, and blames Tessa. He thinks himself of how to escape, but knows that he can't dig himself out like last time. The main entrance to his cell creaks open and Ferdale flinches at the flicker of light, wondering who his visitor is. The visitor taunts him about his stay in the cells. The hood of the cloak they wear covers his head, save for the grin he sports. Ferdale curses at the visitor for the teasing. He continues to mouth out insults until the visitor brings out the key to the cell. It dawns on Ferdale that his freedom is right before his eyes. The visitor asks Ferdale to make a deal for his freedom. Ferdale agrees to the deal and gets the key. In addition to the key, Ferdale gets a small sack containing red chips in them. He asks what they are for, but the stranger tells him to go to Lindahar and ask for Ginger Whiskers, who will tell him what to do. Ferdale tries to complain that the stranger hasn't told him something, but is cut short when the stranger wishes him good luck. The candle in the stranger's hands goes out and Ferdale asks into the darkness if the stranger is still there. Meanwhile in Tessa's room, she tells him to hold her that it's not too late to stop. The morning sunlight illuminates Hert being intimate to Tessa. During their intimacy, he remembers Ferdale's words about her seducing his father, but he doesn't let it get to him. Hert wakes up next to Tessa in her bedroom. He swears to himself for falling asleep. Tessa moves under the covers and he discovers the marks on her back. He thinks to himself that they aren't ordinary scars, she must have been abused. Then it dawns on him why she was always screaming and trembling. He had always wondered why. He asks himself if it was because she was afraid and then swears to himself. He gets out of the bed and dresses up. He tells himself that he needs to find out what happened to her, and also question Ferdale. Jeffrey knocks on the door and greets Hert. His breathing is ragged as he contemplates how to tell Hert. Taking the bull by the horns, he says that Ferdale Jutted is missing. In his office, Hert addresses Jeffrey and Mosen about the current situation. He asks them if they expect him to believe that Ferdale just disappeared without a trace. He says that the officers on duty were ambushed and that was how he could disappear. Jeffrey says it's an outside job. Mosen agrees with Jeffrey. He says that they can't rule out the possibility of outside interference considering the circumstances. Hert slams his hand on the table and asks if it looks like a game to them. Hert takes a moment to think to himself, knowing that Ferdale is the heir of Jutted in name only, so who would go out of their way to help him? He knew something was off and there must be a clue that they aren't seeing. It dawns on Hert on what the clue was and he tells them that there may be an accomplice amongst them. Hert tells the guards that he wants everyone in the castle investigated and they should send out search parties. The guards chorus an affirmation and move out except Jeffrey. Hert turns his back to him and instructs him to bring Ferdale back alive. He also asks Jeffrey if there's nothing to report on this morning. Jeffrey keeps mute, which forces Hert to turn around and glare at him. Jeffrey stumbles on his words, but manages to tell Hert that he's sorry to not have anything to report. Hert nods and tells Jeffrey to send the report he asked for to his room. Jeffrey breaks into a sweat, but still replies with a yes, and breathes in relief. Manny greets Tessa as she wakes up. Tessa asks Manny where she is, and Manny tells her that she is in the room next to Hert's. Tessa stutters while asking why. Hert enters the room and joins the conversation by asking her if she isn't eager to have a better room. He stands in the doorway and looks at Tessa. Tessa sweats as she addresses Hert with his title. Manny informs Tessa that she's going outside and leaves. Hert walks deeper into the room and approaches Tessa. She avoids eye contact and takes in the interior of the room. The furniture is ruby green with gold accents doting on them. The sunlight hits them at a perfect angle that makes them look picturesque. Hert feels her temperature, which causes her to flinch. He tells her that the doctor is coming and that Tessa should ask her for anything she will need. He also says that her meal will soon come and asks how she's feeling. She tells him that she is fine. He threatens her that if she lies, her maid and doctor will be the first to leave and she shouldn't pretend to be fine. Sweat breaks out on Tessa's face as she pleads with him not to. He tells her to take care of herself then. A knock on the door alerts the duo that they have company. Hert tells them to come in. Maids walk into the bedroom and lay down a feast. Tessa complains that the food is too much while Hert tells her that he is joining her to eat. He asks her if she can get up, and she replies that she can but falls in her attempt to stand. The maids turn to look at them, but don't say anything as Hert helps her up. Tessa argues that she can manage, but he tells her to stay still because she can't walk. He carries her bridal style to the table where the food is and mutters a thank you. Suddenly, Hert gets down on one knee and massages Tessa's leg. She says that he doesn't need to do that, but he tells her not to say that again. He says that they need to work on her circulation. Hert instructs the maids to leave them alone and Tessa sighs in relief. He asks her what she feels like eating and Tessa says she's fine eating anything. He nods and puts a variety of food on her plate. Tessa asks herself why Hert is being nice to her. He gave her a room next to his and is eating with her. She doesn't know how to behave. Hert notices her absent-minded nature, and asks her if anything is wrong and if she won't eat. She tells him that nothing is wrong and she will start eating now. He says nothing and waits for her to eat, but she continues to stare at him. Seeing as Hert isn't saying anything, she asks him to go on, but he says that he's fine and she should go ahead. After some time, she stops eats and says she's full. Hert frowns and tells her that she eats like a bird and used to have a better appetite than this. She bears an uneasy smile as he continues to speak. He says that maybe that's why she's still small, and she asks him in return if she really is. She then addresses him with his title saying he is taller, but Hert cuts her short with a frown. He tells her to call him by his name. She begs his pardon, and he repeats himself by saying that she call him his name like she used to or his nickname Herty. Speechless, she swallows. She disagrees, but he interrupts her by asking her why she can't call him by his first name just like she used to. She argues, but he tells her not to make a fuss over it. She apologizes as her eyes well up with tears. He gets upset and slams the table and tells her to stop apologizing, and that he hates it when she speaks to him formally. A knock interrupts the duo. The doctor named Kenneth asks that they excuse her as she enters. She greets Hert with his title. Hert acknowledges her with a nod and tells her to go ahead. The doctor leads Tessa from the dining table to the bed. The doctor tells her that her health is improving, but she should still be careful. Hert thanks Kenneth for her consultation. Kenneth hands a container, and says that she finished the former one so here's another. She glares at Hert, but says nothing. Kenneth instructs Tessa to apply it, and she also gives one to Hert as well. She says that it isn't a miracle cure. He must allow Tessa to heal, it's top priority. Tessa cheeks flush, as she calls the doctor's name in her mind. Kenneth tells them she's going and leaves the room. Both are wordless as Hert stares at the salve and Tessa stares at the sheets. Tessa glances at Hert, but remains quiet. He looks at her and calls her name. He changes his mind and tells her to rest. As evening draws near, Mosen comes to meet Hert with some documents. He greets Hert and tells him that the paper are his report from Jeffrey. Hert maintains his composure as he reads the report. The report tells the story of how Tessa became the 8th wife to Marquess de Juttet, offered by Baron Setterbian instead of his own daughter. Tessa was rejected by the Marquess, and shunned by the household after the deception was revealed. Her health became terrible due to multiple suicide attempts, extensive abuse from Ferdale which had gone unchecked. Rage boiled through Hert's blood as he ordered Mosen to bring Ferdale to him. In a hidden room in the castle, sun shines through the window and illuminates Janet and Geoffrey having tea. Janet sips her tea and drops her cup. She tells Geoffrey that she isn't asking for much, and that he needs to play for more time. Sweat breaks out on his brows and he responds by saying that it won't be easy with Sir Shine, and that Janet is telling him to stick his neck out for her. Janet picks her cup of tea and asks him why he's talking like that. She says that he is the Marquis de Borwin's man, and that Hert can't hurt him. Jeffrey screams that he is capable of wringing his neck no matter whose man he is if he gets on his bad side. Janet's demeanor suddenly changes and the air around her becomes stiff. She blows a fuse as she tells him that he won't do it. Jeffrey stutters, saying that he's not saying that he won't do it. He pauses and clenches his hands and agrees. Janet smiles and tells him why he didn't say it from the begging, that Jeffrey should be more considerate of her condition. Annoyance coats Jeffrey's tone, as he tells her that she is not even pregnant. Janet laughs and tells him that people think she is. He tells her that she is impossible. He stands up from the chair and moves to leave and tells Janet not to come and see him to avoid rumors. She smiles and tells him to tell them that they are having an affair. Jeffrey turns to look at her as if she is mad. She laughs and tells him that she is joking and he should have a sense of humor. Jeffrey regards her with a cold look and tells her not to joke about such things. He claims not to be the kind of guy that goes around stealing other people's wives. Janet's laugh echoes round the room. She asks if he criticizes Hert. She says that was brutal and that men don't go easy on each other. Jeffrey thinks to himself, that woman. Janet continues to taunt him by saying that she wonders if Hert knows what his deputy thinks of him. Jeffrey hurries to leave the room before Janet would make him say something worse. She continues to speak, oblivious to the new presence in the room. She tells Jeffrey that it would be easier to say that they were having an affair. Jeffrey turns around at her statement, just in time to see Hert in the doorway, and panics internally. A flashback reveals Tessa and Hert when they were younger. Tessa adjusts her hair and kneels on the grass. She calls for Hert's attention toward a pretty flower. Hert looks at her in confusion and Tessa points at the flower, telling him that it's the pink one she is referring to. She says that she has never seen this kind of flower in this place. She wonders how it got here. He tells that the wind must have carried the seed here because wind carries seeds for long distances. Tessa says that it could be a bird that dropped the seed there, affirming the point that seeds travel in many ways. Hert agrees with her. Then she sits on the ground and calls Hert by his nickname, saying that both of them are like seeds, because something carried them just like how seeds travels. Just like how the seed took root and blossomed, they arrived in Fitzrold and grew leaves. Maybe if they are patient, they'll blossom as well. Hert looks to the sky and says that he hoped so. Tessa smiles and calls him Herty. She takes his hands and tells him that the weather is nice, that they should continue walking. Hert blushes and allows her to lead them through the forest. She makes flower crowns and puts it on their heads. She holds both of his hands in hers and looks at him. The sun reflects on her, making her look heavenly. She asks him what would he like to be when he grows up. He tells her that he wishes to be a knight, so he can protect the people that he loves. Tessa beams and says that it's wonderful, he'll be a knight just like fairy tales. Then he asks her about her ambition, and she smiles shyly. She tells him that she wishes to leave the orphanage when she grows up and live in her own house. A frown grows on Hert's face. He asks her if she plans to live there by herself. Tessa laughs and says that she wants to live with him, and that Hert is her best friend. Hert beams and says yes, and it's what he wants as well. The flashback ends and we see Herty in Tessa's bedroom. He watches her sleep and admires her beauty. The sunset rays invade the room and create a hollow just the same as years ago. She still looks just as beautiful. He strokes her cheek and she opens one of her eyes. Groggily, she confirms if it really is him. Hert confirms that it's him that woke her up. She closes her eyes and mutters that it's him again, that she saw him in a dream. Intrigued, Hert leans forward and asks what kind of dream was it. Tessa turns and responds that it was when they were children, playing the meadow. He tells her that it's a good dream and she mutters a yes. A few minutes pass and she calls his name and mutters an apology. Hert strokes her hair, causing her to cry. She says that she hasn't done anything for him. She's sorry that she couldn't keep their promise. If she hadn't ruined it all, he would have become a good knight. They would have had their little house, and they wouldn't have wanted anything else. She dozes back to sleep. Hert calls her name, grips her hand and tells her that he wanted the same. He rests his head on her shoulder and tells her that's what he ever wanted. In the dead of the night, Hert stands with his men and barks orders at them. He tells Tem that he wants them to bring the prisoner, and they are free to turn over every stone in the village. If they see anyone acting suspicious or looks like Ferdale, they should bring them to him immediately. The chorus in affirmative and marched outwards in search of Ferdale. Hert curses out Ferdale as he watches his men venture into the night. Morning comes and we raise from the sunrise illuminating Tessa's room. Different fabrics lay on a chair and shine with the light. Janet squeals and says that the fabrics are the latest. She beckons Tessa closer to pick. Tessa calls Janet's name in confusion. She thinks to herself and wonders if it was a dream, ever since she had changed rooms. Janet tells her to get her dress made with the fabric in her arms. Tessa breaks out a cold sweat, and mutters about her uncertainty. Janet brings our blue jewelry box that has green emerald earrings in them. She tells Tessa that if she made the dress and pairs it with these earrings, she'd look like a nymph. Tessa stands in the background with an uneasy feeling building her, as the tailor commends Janet's choice. Janet nods and says that it's Tessa's style. Tessa thinks to herself, knowing that her clothes are shabby, she feels like there's no need for any of this. She wonders what Hert is thinking. He knows that these costly things don't mean anything to her if she can't stand by his side. Janet is tired of waiting for Tessa to make up her mind. She tells her that if she doesn't choose, she will choose for her despite how much it will cost Hert. Sweat coats Tessa's brow and she flinches at Janet's words. She tells her to wait. Janet tells her not to stand still. There are many fabrics and there has to be one that she must like. Tessa sputters the number. She looks at the fabrics and decides on one of them. She believes that she doesn't want to waste Hert's hard-earned money. She'll just choose one of the less expensive. Janet holds Tessa's hand with a frown. She tells Tessa that the fabric is poor in quality and has an off color. Her tone rises as she shouts at Tessa, telling her that she chose the cheapest looking one, and that she should pick the one she really likes and it must be a good one. Tessa breaks out another set of sweat and settles on a teal-colored material. She thinks to herself that it is pretty. She tugs on it and says she will take it. Janet nods and points to other materials as well. Tessa cautions her saying that it is too much. Janet tells her that she was going to pick 20 knowing that Hert would want to see her in more than one dress. She says that Tessa won't make Hert like her if she looks like a cheapskate. She puts it that you can't buy just one thing from a seller that comes to your home. Janet sighs and hopes she made herself clear. She urges Tessa to pick out more fabrics and add ribbons and brooches to them. When they finally finish, both women collapse on a chair. Tessa takes in Janet's condition and offers her a tart. Both women hears carriages moving and looks outside the window, just in time to see a woman entering a carriage and leaving. Sighing, Janet says that she sees Lady Anisha is going back home. Tessa's mood turns gloomy at the thought of home. Tessa turns to ask Janet if she were going home, saying it was only 2 of them left. Janet pauses with the fork in her mouth. Placing her hand on her round tummy, she says that she doubts if she will be welcomed back home, especially in her condition. It's best not to travel. Tessa asks her if she likes children and Janet tells her that she isn't sure. But she knows that if she had a girl, she would be a darling little thing. Tessa nods and offers her agreement. Janet asks Tessa if she would like to have any children either. Tessa asks herself if she even likes children. Ignorant of the battle in her mind, Janet continues to question Tessa if she doesn't want to have children of her own. A flashback reveals Tessa and Hert sitting on the grass, looking at the stars at the dead of the night. Hert tells Tessa that he doesn't want to have children even after he gets married. Tessa questions the reason with a frown. Hert tells her that it's because he never knew his family, and he's sure he won't be a good father. He closes his eyes, hands behind his head, and lays down on the grass. Tessa follows his lead, uncertainty building in stomach. She tells him that she knows how he feels. Back in the present, she thinks to herself, not knowing what a parent's love feels like. She flinches as Janet says that the status of her courtship with Hert was a good one, if not they wouldn't be eating or sleeping together. Tessa thinks to herself. Deep within she feels it's not like that. Janet consoles her, telling her that everything will turn out right, and that Tessa should keep her updated on the happenings of the courtship. Tessa bows her head and asks Janet why she thinks things are going well between Hert and her, because Hert could choose anyone he pleases. Janet interrupts her and grips her, assuring her that he won't. Tessa looks up in astonishment. Janet tells her that Hert is attracted to her because she is a lovely person. Tessa's mind tells her that Hert can't love, he can't love a traitor. The evening sun covers the land and creates a picturesque view. A view that Hert enjoys as Mosen stands behind him. Mosen tells him that they are yet to see Ferdale, anyone that looks like him, or any suspicious people. Hert frowns and says that they should return due to the waste of time. Mosen agrees with him and tells him that he will order the troops to pull out. Hert thinks to himself as they walk, it seems as if Ferdale has fled the estate, but the question was how. An old woman approaches the men while hawking her sweet treats. The sight of the woman beckons of Hert, and he stops. Turning around, he asks Mosen if he has any money on him. Mosen nods and brings out a few coins, which Hert gingerly takes. Hert turns to the woman, asks her to give him all of her treats. The woman looks surprised, but happily gives him the treats. He hopes that she likes them, because he knows that she is weak and needs to fatten up to prevent her from fainting everywhere. He also buys her the treats in hope that she'll stop telling him to end her life. It's dead in the night, and Tessa stares outside wondering why Hert is keeping late tonight. She nods as Manny soothes her worries. Manny tells her not to worry and she should lie down. She needs to rest after being stressed with Lady Janet Belrodham during the day. Tessa thanks Manny as she lies in her bed. Manny wishes her a good night and leaves. Tessa turns in bed, thinking about Hert. She tosses and turns as the night gets quieter. She hopes for him to come back soon. She begins to wonder why he is being good to her. Could he have forgiven her? Shaking her head firmly, she thinks that it couldn't be. He must have seen the scars of her back and feels sorry for her. The thought shakes Tessa to the core, and she begins to cry in the bed while having the pillow in a death grip. She tells herself not to get her hopes up, because she is nothing but a traitor. In another part of the castle, Geoffrey approaches Hert with Janet behind him. Hert asks the duo if everything in the paper they give him is true, and Janet affirms it with his title. Janet goes on to add that it could probably have been worse since Ferdale was popular for doing cruel deeds behind closed doors. That is why she is grateful for Hert for saving Tessa from Ferdale's wickedness. Hert ponders on her words, knowing within himself that doesn't mean he has forgiven Tessa. He can't help but wonder why she won't tell him the truth. Past midnight, the door to Tessa's room creaks open. In walks Hert with the treats he bought for her. He places them on a table. Suddenly the candle Manny lit goes out, and she hears a distant rustling sound. Tessa sits up and sees Hert in her room. Hert apologizes and tells her that he meant to be quiet so as not to wake her. Tessa assures him that she had already been awake. He says that he was told that she didn't finish her supper. He warns her not to be silly, she needs to eat and get strong. She tells him that she will as she blushes. He asks her about the salve and she says she put some on during the day. He washes his hands and urges her to allow him to see. Tessa tells him that she is fine and he shouldn't look. Hert ignores her and raises the covers to see, but she calls his name in embarrassment as she flushes. He justifies his actions by saying that how will he know if she is fine if she doesn't apply it properly. He tells her to spread her legs so she can see. She blushes and reluctantly spreads her legs. He observes her and says that it looks better. He takes some of the salve and applies it. He tells her to let him know if it hurts and to not bite her lip. He swears at himself as he rubs it. He thinks to himself how he has turned to an animal, urging himself to stop thinking about it to preserve some form of self-respect and dignity. The two of them blush as Hert applies the salve. Hert tells her when he finishes and she thanks him. He moves to leave her alone, but she stops him. She tells that they can do it he wants to. He tells her to stop and that she means to do what she did for her former husband. She stammers, but folds her arms across her chest with a pout. She looks at him and a bead of sweat travels down her cheek. In split seconds he leans down for a kiss which surprises Tessa. She tries in vain to call his name as she blushes. The kisses lasts close to 30 minutes. Hert tells her that it's not that he doesn't want it. When she is better he will take her till she begs for mercy. And so she shouldn't work him up. Early morning sun shines upon the estate and into Elena's room. She asks Tessa what she has been up to these days and Tessa hums in confusion. Elena asks again about what Tessa likes to do in her free time. Both women drink tea as they discuss. Tessa tells her that she's sure about it. Elena asks her if she knows how to read and write. This causes Tessa to flinch and remain silent. Oblivious to Tessa's antics, Elena continues to speak saying that she could teach her if she was interested. Tessa's insecurities crowd her mind as she thinks if she could really learn to read and write. She goes as far as to insult herself. She once thought she'd be reading books and discussing it with others, but how could she learn now? Again she insults herself. Elena takes Tessa's hand in and says to her in a reassuring manner that it isn't hard to learn. Taking the conversation in another direction, Elena asks her what she prefers, if cooking would fancy her. Tessa asks if she thinks it were possible for her to learn and Elena assures her that it is. Elena asks her about baking some cookies and tells her that it's the perfect gift to show someone gratitude. Tessa's cheeks redden as she figures out what Elena is implying. She knew she'd want to thank Hert for being kind to her these past few days. She says that she'd like to try baking cookies. Elena smiles and says she'll have Senna, who is her maid, to prepare the ingredients. Back in the castle, Hert questions Mosen on the whereabouts of Tessa. Mosen tells him that Tessa has gone to see Elena. Hert rests his head on his palm, reads his report and replies. He says that he thought the woman was confined to her tower. He asks how she knows about Tessa. Mosen tells him that Elena must know Tessa, as one of the younger wives. He says that she doesn't have a motive for approaching Tessa. Hert seems unimpressed and responds that there's nothing to be gotten anyway. He thinks to himself about who Tessa really is. She cowers a lot, as if it's what she was born to do. Any minute she'd start it, and here he was thinking she's a minx. He insults her in his mind and wonders what she was thinking. He cracks his knuckles and says what a bother, that he'll believe it when he sees it. Sweat drips from Mosen's brow as he asks Hert if he was calling him a liar. Hert responds that he was as if expecting Mosen to defend himself. Indeed, Mosen defends himself, as he sputters asking Hert how could he. Mosen stops himself and switches tactics. He asks Hert to drop everything and just be with Tessa for the whole day. Hert pauses in his movement by the door and smirks. He says that he'd like nothing better, and doesn't think he can restrain himself. Mosen thinks to himself how incredible the situation was. He wonders out loud as Hert leaves him alone in his office, if he should be paying courtship to Janet. Dressed in an apron, Tessa greets Hert at the door and asks what he is doing here. Hert walks deeper into the room and says he was wondering what she was doing here. Tessa apologizes and says that she'll be ready in 1 minute. Hert ignores her words and asks her what she's up to dressed in an apron. Elena walks into the room and says to Hert that they are baking cookies. She introduces herself as Elena Juttet and tells him it's nice to meet him. Hert introduces himself back and says he's here to help. Elena tells him he arrived just in time for the cookies she's making with Tessa. She invites him to stay for tea. Hert looks at them and wonders about the cookies because Elena hasn't touched the treats he brought for her. Hert tells Elena he can't stay and asks her to excuse him. Elena smiles and says he must be busy. Hert says he will send someone to move her things. Elena says that's very kind of him. Elena tells Senna to bring the cookies and give them to Tessa. Tessa bows and says thank you. Hert takes the basket of cookies from Tessa and says he will carry it. Tessa bows again and follows Hert out the door. Elena tells them to be careful on their way back because the path is not good and they should watch their steps on the old stairs. Hearing this, Hert picks up Tessa in his arms like a bride and carries her. As the sunset shines through the window, Elena watches them leave and tells Senna that things are going well so far, as long as they stay this way. Senna reassures her not to worry because everything will be fine. Elena hopes that's true, saying they have peace now, but it won't be long before she has to say goodbye. She thanks Senna for all her help, saying she couldn't have done it without her. Elena tells her to stay careful because even though they've gotten rid of many spies, there are still many eyes in the castle. Senna clasps her hands and says there will be more spies, because the estate is too valuable to let go. She knows Elena is prepared, but there will always be unforeseen challenges. Elena tells Senna that she will be careful. She takes out a seal stamp and presses it onto a letter, saying that Senna should stay close to Tessa for now. She thinks Tessa might be useful in case of an emergency. The sunset paints a beautiful scene over the city. In the shadows, someone opens a creaky door to a building. The person is Ferdale. He walks down the hallway, asking himself how much further he has to go as he follows a strange man. In the hallway, blood splatters the walls and floors. Cages are pushed against the walls, and inside them are people wearing ragged clothes. Ferdale starts to feel nervous, and sweat begins to bead on his forehead. He asks the strange man in front of him where he is being taken. The man, who has a mustache tattoo on his neck, gruffly says that there are rules here and Ferdale needs to hand over something. The man opens a door and tells Ferdale to go inside. Ferdale asks what he is supposed to hand over. The man shoves Ferdale through the door and says he needs to give them whatever is in his pocket. He tells Ferdale to hurry because they are waiting for him. Hert hands her the reins of the horse and says to take them, assuring her not to be afraid because he is right here. He tells her that the horse is gentle and she won't fall off as long as she doesn't make any sudden moves. Her cheeks turn bright red, as she admits she has never ridden a horse before. He reassures her, saying he is right next to her, and she doesn't need to worry. She starts to sweat and asks if they can just walk together instead. He asks if she came here on foot. He frowns and says that next time, she should bring her maid and one of the knights with her. He also says he will arrange for a guard next time. She argues that she doesn't need a guard and can manage on her own. He ignores her and keeps talking, saying that the marquis will come to the castle instead. He asks if she traveled all this way just to bake a few cookies. Tessa sits on the horse and holds the reins tightly. He holds the reins closer to the horse's mouth and walks beside them, guiding the horse along. She thinks to herself about whether it's really worth it just for a few cookies. He notices her deep in thought and asks her what she is thinking. She clutches the basket tightly and apologizes for her hesitation. As she grips the reins, she accidentally causes the horse to rear up on its hind legs out of fear. Tessa screams loudly, frightened by the sudden movement. He tries hard to calm the horse, but it's not easy. He keeps telling her not to worry and assures her that he is there to help. The basket falls from her hands and the cookies fly through the air. He feels really bad about the basket falling. He kneels down to pick it up and removes the cloth from the basket. He sees that all the cookies are broken. She tells him it's okay, because she was going to throw them away anyway. He looks at her, puzzled, and asks what she means by throwing them away. He picks up one of the cookies and says that they are still good to eat. He asks her if the cookies are whole grain, because they taste really good. She blushes and smiles at his compliment. He asks her why she made so many cookies, when she didn't eat any of the treats he bought for her. She explains that she wanted to give some to Janet, Manny, and also to him. She says that giving him the treats was her way of saying thank you. He asks her what she is thanking him for. He watches her fidget and blush while she tries to answer. Then he realizes what she's thanking him for and starts to blush himself. He smiles and continues eating the cookie. He joins her on the horse, sitting behind her. Together, they ride through the forest. After a while, he makes them get off the horse. He says they should walk a bit because the doctor said it would be good for her. He thinks to himself that he has no idea what she's thinking and feels like he's dealing with someone who needs constant help. He stops walking and calls her name. She answers him. He sighs and asks her why she didn't tell him about what Ferdale did. She tilts her head, looking confused. He keeps talking, asking her why she kept it to herself and didn't mention Ferdale's actions toward her. He takes her hands in his and says that she could have told him about the scars on her back. He says that she should have let him know it wasn't her fault. He tells her that if he had known from the start, he wouldn't have treated her the way he did. Tessa's mind is troubled as she remembers how badly Ferdale treated her. She feels hurt thinking about how no one in the castle tried to help her. Some people even told her directly that they wouldn't help because they didn't want to lose their position in the castle. Ferdale's cruel words keep interrupting Hert's attempts to reassure her. He grips her upper arms and tries to make her listen, but it's becoming harder and harder. Tessa's mind fills with memories of coming back from Ferdale covered in bruises. Janet sees her and asks what happened. Tessa tells her not to worry about it. Janet loses her patience and asks how she can not mind when Tessa looks like this. She demands to know who did this to her, saying maybe she can help. Suddenly, Ferdale comes into the room and slaps Janet. He points an accusing finger at her and insults her. He says it's her fault because she's taking Tessa's side. Tessa starts to blame herself, feeling like it's her fault that Janet got hurt. She chokes on her emotions and wonders why she should burden others with her problems. She decides that everyone seems happier if she just stays quiet and behaves. Finally, she talks to him and says it's nothing to worry about. She thinks to herself that she fought hard for her own happiness. She tells him again that it's really nothing at all. In another part of town, horses pull a carriage down the road after dark. A man with purple hair asks Lee what she is reading. Lee smiles and asks her companion if they would like to see, saying it's a fascinating story. The companion takes the paper and looks at it, pausing to think about what to say. Finally, he says it's tragic. Noticing his hesitation, Lee replies that everyone has their own story. He talks about Hert, saying it isn't fair that Hert was sold into slavery against his will. He says it's a sad situation. Lee crosses his legs and taps his foot on the floor of the carriage, saying that those without power can only submit. Lee smiles at the pocket watch in his hands and asks his companion if they want to know something. He tells them that papers and contracts are just smoke and mirrors. He says that Tessa and Hert are like cogs in a machine, just parts that keep things running. Tessa sits in the castle, thinking about what happened between her and Hert when they were coming from Elena's part of the estate. The day turns gloomy as rain starts to fall. Hert turns away from her and says she doesn't have to say anything right now, just to let him know when she's ready. Tessa flinches at his words. Her shoulders slump and her face looks sad. Hert turns to her and says she needs to promise him one thing. He gently strokes her face and tells her not to betray him again. He cups her face in his hands and makes her look at him, saying she shouldn't abandon him ever again. He thinks to himself that if she makes this promise, he will forget what happened 7 days ago. Back in the castle, Hert walks over to her and pulls her out of her thoughts. Wearing only his trousers, he asks if she isn't going to wash up since she is soaked from the rain. In the middle of the night, fireflies dance around the cottage. Inside, one man is on his knees, nervously laughing as he assures another man that they will find out all they can. The second man stands up and says that sounds good and that he will leave it to him. The first man agrees, bows, and then runs into the cottage. He bursts into the room and shouts, "Anna." Anna turns to him from her book with a frown and says, "Goodness, can't you knock? I'm doing inventory right now." "What's the problem?" Sweat is making his hair stick to his forehead, as he tells her that her inventory is the least of their problems. He asks if she remembers the red-headed girl from 7 years ago. Anna's frown deepens as she asks how she is supposed to remember. The man helps her recall by saying that the girl was from the orphanage that was sold to the Baron. Anna closes the book and looks thoughtful. She asks if it's the same person who was sold with the boy. The man gestures wildly, confirming her question. Anna then asks about them. The man explains that Hert works for Lee Borwin and insults Lee. Anna grips the book tightly and tries to make sense of what the man is saying. She asks him to explain more. The man starts crying and says they could be in danger if Lee finds out. He thought they were safe after the Baron died, but now he's worried. He adds that if Hert starts investigating, it's only a matter of time before problems come. Anna snaps at the man to be quiet so she can think. She starts pacing and says there has to be a way to fix this. She wonders how they sold Hert and then suddenly remembers something. She realizes that they made it seem like the girl was the one who forged the papers and betrayed him. She snaps her fingers and says they need to find the papers before Hert does. Anna tells the man they need to find Tessa before she can reveal the truth. She trails off, lost in thought. The man gulps and finishes Anna's thought by asking if she plans to get rid of Tessa. Anna snickers and asks if he has a better idea than hers. Back at the castle, Tessa looks away from Hert, her face flushed as she fidgets. She tells him she needs a minute. Hert thinks she means he should help her undress, but Tessa clarifies that's not what she means. Tessa tells Hert that she can undress herself. Hert mentions that he is wet too and suggests they bathe together. Tessa asks why they need to bathe together, and Hert wonders if she doesn't want to. Tessa says it's not that but doesn't finish her thought. Hert tells her it's okay. He starts to undress her, making both of them blush. He then invites her into the tub, and they get in. Hert stands behind her and washes her, telling her to hold still while he nuzzles her neck. He playfully blames her for acting like a dog in heat. Tessa turns in the water and offers to help him. Hert frowns and says she's not fully recovered yet. She insists that she can still make him feel good because she wants to help. She then starts to initiate their intimacy. After the shower, Hert gets dressed and meets up with Jeffrey to give him some instructions. Jeffrey, clearly frustrated, exclaims whether Hert even understands what he's asking him to do. Hert just smiles and points out that Jeffrey must have been curious about his past at some point. He explains that he can't trust Borwin. Jeffrey suggests looking into his past, but Hert interrupts him, saying he's actually giving him permission to go ahead with the investigation. Hert looks at the papers in his hands and frowns. He realizes something isn't right, and decides he needs to find out for himself how Tessa sold him off. He tells Jeffrey he can dig as much as he wants into the matter. Meanwhile, in another part of town, Jeffrey is in disguise, helping a woman carry a heavy box. The woman comments on how strong he is and tells him where to drop the box. Jeffrey peeks inside the box and asks her what's in it. The woman tells Jeffrey that the box just has junk to sell later, and says it's time to clear out the place. Jeffrey continues asking around the town, and then meets a young lady who smiles at him seductively. She asks what he wants and notes that strangers don't usually come here unless they are lost or looking for something. Wearing a cowboy hat and a cloak, Jeffrey blends in easily with the crowd. He pulls out a book from his cloak and tells the woman he has a few questions. He asks her if she knows anything about the Fitzroy orphanage. The woman repeats the name of the orphanage, and thinks about it for a little while. Jeffrey then explains that the orphanage was doing fine until it suddenly disappeared about 7 years ago. He asks if she has any idea why that happened. The woman responds that the orphanage burned down. Jeffrey nods and asks what happened to the people who were there. She frowns and says she doesn't know. She explains that everyone went their separate ways after the fire, so they could be alive or dead. She really doesn't have any information about them. Jeffrey sweats a little and tells the woman that he understands and thinks she's being careful. The woman then asks why he's so concerned. Jeffrey writes in his book that the whereabouts of the orphans are unknown. He explains that he is looking for someone who was an orphan there. He describes her as having red hair and green eyes. The woman thinks for a moment and then asks if he means Tessa. Jeffrey asks her if she knows Tessa. The woman says she knows Tessa, and that they were quite close at the orphanage. She adds that, as far as she knows, Tessa found a good job and is doing well for herself. Jeffrey writes down that Tessa has a good job and asks if the woman can tell him more about her. The woman explains that Tessa spent a lot of time with the director before she left on her own. She doesn't know the exact details, but she remembers Tessa was happy and said her future was settled. The woman thinks Tessa is sweet and reliable, so she assumes the director must have found a good job for her. Jeffrey asks if it was one of the director's duties to find jobs for orphans. The woman defends the director by saying that it's really tough for women out there, and that the director was just trying to help. Jeffrey then asks if she knows where the director is right now. The woman explains that someone came by here not long ago, and told her to give a red chip to anyone who came asking about the director. She opens her hand, showing Jeffrey the red chip, and hands it to him. Inside a castle, a man with purple hair gets up from his bed and starts walking through the halls, calling out Lee's name. He finally finds her and greets her with a "good morning," while wrapping his arm around her waist. Lee responds to the greeting but doesn't say much. The purple-haired man then tells Lee that Jeffrey is on his way to Lindenhall. Lee reads a note that says a friend of Tessa's was seen near Fitzroy and is now heading to Lindenhall. The note adds that there will be more updates soon. Lee gets annoyed and complains that Hert is wasting Jeffrey's time on this search about his father. The purple-haired man agrees, saying it's unlikely they'll find anything in the end anyway. Lee says that there are only fake papers and they won't be useful. Her companion asks what she expected since she refused to share any information with him. Lee replies that he agreed to find the girl, but he never said for how long. Her companion calls her name, but she ignores him and defends herself by saying that she at least sent someone to protect the girl, mentioning Janet. The purple-haired man says that Lee didn't tell him about Janet. Lee responds by saying they were at war, and she couldn't just give up her best attack dog. Lee adds that if it were up to him, he would have dropped everything and rushed to her immediately. She lights a large cigar and explains that she had to get her money's worth out of Janet before she went back to her original owner. The purple-haired man leans on Lee's shoulder, as she says that he still can't understand how she became a jutted. He tells her she's being unfair. Lee smirks and replies that what's done is done. Back in the castle, Hert and Elena are drinking tea and talking. Elena tells Hert that he won't be able to manage the castle, and its estate all by himself. She says that soon enough, he'll realize it's too much for him. Hert says he has heard everything he needs to hear. Elena then offers to train Tessa on how to manage the house. Hert looks at her and asks what she's really planning. Elena replies that she suspects this could be a trap and adds that she isn't asking for a lot. She just wants his help with this task. She says she is counting on his kindness and his position to assist her. Elena is confident that Hert understands how things were between her and her husband. Elena explains that her plan is to expose the family for what it really is. Hert asks if this is all about revenge. Hert then asks her about Ferdale. Elena tells him that she has no intention of apologizing for what her son did. Hert slams his hand on the table and asks what she means. Elena says that while Ferdale's actions against Tessa are horrible, they are his actions, not hers. She doesn't see any reason to apologize on his behalf. Instead, she promises one thing: when Hert captures Ferdale, he can do whatever he wants with him. Hert starts to sweat. Elena continues by saying that, although she gave birth to Ferdale, she never really considered him her own. She adds, heaven forbid. That's exactly why she wants to bring down the Juttet family, because this family means nothing to her anymore. Meanwhile, Lee comments that it looks like someone has taken advantage of Jeffrey's absence. She's pleased and says that everything is going exactly as planned. On the rooftop of the castle, Janet is lying on a sunbed with cucumbers on her face. Suddenly, she jumps up and shouts that Rang is gone. The cucumbers fall from her face and land on her dress, as she leaves the castle in a hurry. Manny tells her that Rang packed quickly and left in a rush. Janet comments that he looked like he was going on a long journey. She puts a hand on her forehead and wonders what he was thinking, leaving the castle at a time like this. Manny then asks what they should do now without Jeffrey. Janet lies back down with a sigh and says that she can't show up at the main building anymore. She mentions that she already has enough trouble in the annex. Manny starts putting the cucumbers back on Janet's face. Janet then asks why Jeffrey would run away. Manny replies that only Hert will know the answer. Janet frowns and says she smells something suspicious. Meanwhile, Dr. Kenneth is in the castle, checking Tessa's vitals. He tells her that she is doing well. Tessa asks if that's really true. Dr. Kenneth nods and says that Tessa has gained weight, which shows she is getting better. Dr. Kenneth then turns to Hert and frowns, saying that Tessa should avoid straining herself until she is fully healed. Tessa blushes at the comment. Hert tells Dr. Kenneth that he can leave and also instructs Manny to bring Tessa's clothes. Manny replies, yes, sir. Manny brings the clothes, and Hert helps Tessa get dressed. He asks her if the clothes are too tight, and she tells him that they are all right. As she gets dressed, she wonders to herself if any of this is really necessary. Hert ties Tessa's corset and asks her if it's okay. She says it's fine. Tessa blushes as she thinks to herself that she has never heard of a lord waiting on a lady like this. She worries that if word gets out, it will damage Hert's reputation. Hert leans forward, resting his head on her shoulder and putting his hand around her belly. He says she is too thin and tells her to let him know if there's anything she wants to eat so he can ask the chef to make it. Tessa blushes again, and says she is fine. Hert comments that she doesn't eat as much as he does. Tessa thinks to herself that he must be a big eater. Hert says he won't be able to have lunch with her while helping her put on her jacket. Tessa figures that he must be busy. Hert then asks if she isn't curious about why he's busy. Tessa calls out his name, and he asks if she isn't curious about what he is up to. She stammers and fidgets with her words. Hert takes her hand and tells her it's nothing serious, he just has some business to handle outside the castle. He gently cups her face and tells her not to skip meals just because he's not around. He adds that she is free to invite other women over, but should avoid going outside the castle. Tessa's face flushes, and she agrees. Cakes and sweet treats are spread out on the table as Tessa, Janet, and Elena sit, eating and sipping tea. Janet thanks Tessa for inviting her, and Tessa says she's happy Janet could come. Janet then says she couldn't believe her eyes when she saw the table. She adds that Hert is very kind, and if she had known Tessa eats like this every day, she would have invited herself over sooner. Tessa starts to respond, but is interrupted by Janet. Janet laughs and says she's just joking. She doesn't want to be a third wheel. Tessa thinks to herself that if Janet only knew that Hert's real goal is to fatten her up. Elena then asks Tessa if she has considered her suggestion. She encourages Tessa by saying it's never too late to learn how to read and write, and that it will be very useful for her. Janet's eyes widen in surprise and she asks Tessa why she doesn't know how to read and write. Tessa's cheeks turn red from embarrassment. Elena clicks her tongue while Janet gasps. Elena tells Tessa there's no need to be ashamed, saying that nobody is born knowing how to read and write. Janet adds that she was a late learner herself. She says that Tessa will have a lot to do when she takes charge of the castle, so it's a good idea for her to start learning now. Janet takes Tessa's hand and tells her she would love it if Tessa wrote to her. She encourages Tessa to start learning so they can keep in touch. Tessa asks if Janet really wants her to write. Janet says she wants Tessa to learn, so they can stay in touch when Janet eventually leaves the castle. Tessa then asks Janet if she is planning to leave. Janet is about to speak, but Tessa interrupts her, asking why, especially after what Janet said last time. Janet apologizes and explains that it's time for her to leave so she can prepare for the birth. Janet thinks to herself, remembering what happened a few hours ago. She was standing in the corridor, wondering where Jeffrey had gone. Janet's ears perk up when she hears Hert and the guards approaching. Hert asks the guards if these are all the men, and they say yes. Janet hides behind a wall and watches as Hert, the guards, and some other men kneel with their heads bowed. Janet thinks to herself that these must be the spies. The wind picks up, blowing grass and Hert's blonde hair around as he draws his sword. In swift movements, he beheads the spies. Janet's eyes widen as she thinks that it could have been her. Thoughts rush through Janet's mind, and she realizes it's time to leave. She grabs Tessa's hand and, with a sad look, says she will miss Tessa, but can't stay here forever. Janet asks Tessa to write to her. Tessa protests, and Janet starts to plead with her. Tessa nods with a flushed face, and Janet smiles, thanking her. Elena looks a bit uncomfortable with their interaction, but quickly says that Tessa is very clever, and will learn in no time. Tessa thinks to herself, breaking into a cold sweat, as she feels unsure about it. In another part of the castle, blackbirds fly around the trees, casting shade over Hert and his men, who are covered in blood. Hert turns away from the bloody corpses and addresses his men. He says he thought he had made it clear that all the spies should be brought to him. One of his men replies that this is indeed all of them. Hert looks up at the sky while wiping the blood from his face. He thinks about the spies sent by Lee Borwen's enemies, knowing they were meant to die while their masters stayed safe at home and looked good. Hert glares at his men and asks where Ferdale is. The men say they haven't found him yet. Hert then asks if they still haven't found who helped Ferdale escape. The men fidget and look away, but one of them finally says they are still searching for that person. One of the men pulls out a brown book and hands it to Hert, saying it contains the most likely suspects. Hert takes the book and looks at it with a frown. He asks if they are sure about these suspects, and they confirm that they are. Hert thinks to himself that it's no surprise they haven't found Ferdale's accomplices yet. In the book, there are pencil drawings of Manny and Janet, with some notes written in pencil next to their pictures about the two women. One of the men calls out to get Hert's attention and mentions Jeffrey. Hert turns and asks if they have heard anything about Rang. He tells them to let him know right away if they see anything suspicious. He says he'd rather catch Rang in the act than have to collect evidence later. The guards nod and reply, yes, sir. Hert thinks to himself about what Janet Juttet might be hiding. In another part of the courtyard, Tessa sits on a wooden chair while Janet picks flowers. She thinks to herself about why she ever thought she could learn to read and write. Janet finishes making a flower crown and puts it on Tessa's head. She tells Tessa that it looks perfect on her, which makes Tessa blush. Tessa takes the crown off her head and blushes even more, saying that Janet is only speaking the truth. She mentions that it also matches her dress nicely. Tessa then asks what material they should choose. Janet smiles and says she knew the crown would suit Tessa, which makes Tessa blush again. Tessa asks Janet why she is so nice to her. Janet grins and says it's better to enjoy the moment, my dear. Tessa asks what Janet means, and Janet comes closer with a mischievous grin. Tessa shakes her head, looking scared. Janet laughs and says she's just joking because they are friends. She asks if Tessa thinks the same way. Tessa, still blushing, says of course Janet is her friend and she is important to her. Janet smiles and says she means a lot to Tessa. Tessa nods. Janet says it's wonderful and she feels the same way. She thanks Tessa for sharing her feelings. Janet tells Tessa that she's grown very fond of her. She says that over these past 2 years, they've become good friends, haven't they? Tessa agrees that they have. Janet then suggests if Tessa would like to go away with her. Tessa looks surprised at her words, remembering how Hert told her he likes her, and that she should never betray him again, or abandon him. She thinks to herself that she can't betray Hert again. Janet bursts into laughter and says she's joking, calling Tessa adorable. Tessa blushes and tells Janet not to tease her. Janet crosses her arms and says she wishes they could leave together, but she doesn't have the courage to get past you-know-who. She says Hert would snatch Tessa back in a second. Janet then asks if Tessa will stay with Hert, saying she thinks she's right. She grips Tessa's hand with a comforting smile. Janet tells Tessa not to worry about a thing. She says that just because she's leaving doesn't mean they'll never see each other again. They can meet anytime Tessa wants and send each other letters once Tessa learns how to write. Janet says that if Tessa ever gets tired of his lordship, she should let her know. She promises to come and whisk Tessa away for a trip, just the two of them. Tessa smiles and says she'd like that very much. Janet reassures Tessa again, saying, "We'll always find a way to see each other, no matter what." She squeezes Tessa's hand warmly, making Tessa feel a bit more at ease. They both laugh, thinking about their future adventures. Janet laughs and tells Tessa they'll get the better of him. Tessa giggles and tells Janet she is funny. Hert approaches the ladies with a frown. Noticing Hert, Janet stands and curtsies while Tessa softly calls his name. Hert pushes past Janet and grips Tessa's hand, pulling her along. Tessa tries to stop him, wanting to say goodbye, but Hert insists they leave. He is convinced that Janet and Rang helped Ferdale escape, and worries about what Janet might tell Tessa. Jealousy also nags at him, thinking of Tessa smiling at Janet in ways she never smiles at him. Hert tightens his grip on Tessa's hand, feeling a mix of anger and protectiveness. Tessa looks back at Janet with a sad smile, but follows Hert, knowing that arguing won't change his mind. Janet watches them go, concern etched on her face, thinking about how to help her friend. Hert smacks his head, telling himself to get a grip. He turns around and calls Tessa's name, reminding her not to get too close to Janet. Tessa stands still, looking unsure and confused. In a different room, Ferdale slams his hands on the table, shouting at the man across from him. The man calmly reassures Ferdale that he would never lie to him. He persuades Ferdale to help them, promising to restore his lost title and estate. Ferdale nods, agreeing to help as long as they keep their promise. The man hands him some papers, and Ferdale signs them without hesitation. If you're eager for the next chapter, drop a comment expressing your interest in a part 3. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated. Until next time, ciao.